Chapter 13, the Inner Scorecard. Once a person begins recognizing how deeply tribe, identity, status, emotion, and inherited narratives shape human life, a difficult question eventually emerges. If so much of the self is socially conditioned, then what does it actually mean to live from within, rather than merely in reaction to the surrounding world? This question sits near the center of self-possession. Because one of the strongest forces shaping human behavior is not truth itself, but social evaluation. Human beings are exquisitely sensitive to approval, admiration, rejection, status, and belonging. Much of life quietly becomes organized around external scorekeeping, how others perceive us, whether we are admired, whether we are successful enough, attractive enough, moral enough, intelligent enough, productive enough, prestigious enough, important enough. People rarely admit this openly because modern culture celebrates individuality rhetorically. Most individuals prefer to imagine themselves internally directed, but careful observation reveals how often external validation quietly governs thought, ambition, behavior, and identity. The desire for approval is not inherently shallow, it is deeply human. For social creatures, acceptance historically carried survival value. Praise activates reward systems. Rejection activates pain systems. The nervous system tracks status and belonging continuously, often beneath awareness. Human beings naturally monitor how they are perceived because social standing historically affected access to safety, resources, mates, cooperation, and protection. But modern environments magnify these pressures dramatically. People now live inside constant visibility. Audiences, metrics, performance signaling, social comparison, identity display, algorithmic validation, and continuous exposure to others' curated lives. Under these conditions, it becomes easy for the external world to quietly colonize the inner one. A person gradually loses the distinction between what they truly value and what receives approval. This confusion often unfolds slowly. Someone chooses a career partly because it signals status. Another adopts political positions partly because they provide moral belonging. Someone performs sophistication, rebellion, virtue, intelligence, spirituality, toughness, or success because the surrounding tribe rewards those identities emotionally. Over time, externally rewarded behavior begins feeling authentic simply because it has been socially reinforced for so long. The individual no longer asks, "Do I actually believe this?" Or, "Does this genuinely align with my values?" The deeper question quietly becomes, how am I being perceived? At this point, life begins orienting around the outer scorecard, and outer scorecards are psychologically unstable. They fluctuate constantly because they depend heavily on comparison, audience reaction, shifting social norms, and the emotional volatility of groups. A person governed primarily by external validation often experiences chronic instability because their sense of worth rises and falls with perception itself. Praise becomes intoxicating. Criticism becomes threatening. Disagreement feels personal. Visibility becomes addictive. Status anxiety quietly organizes behavior. This dynamic can become especially dangerous when external performance fully replaces internal examination. The person becomes highly skilled at managing image while gradually losing contact with deeper orientation altogether. They know how to appear successful, but no longer know whether they are living coherently. This is partly why externally accomplished lives can still feel internally fragmented. A person may achieve admiration, prestige, wealth, influence, or ideological belonging while remaining psychologically disoriented because the life was organized primarily around social reward rather than examined values. The destination was externally rewarded, but internally unchosen. The examined life therefore requires another kind of orientation, the development of an inner scorecard. An inner scorecard does not mean ignoring society completely or becoming emotionally indifferent to others. Human beings remain relational creatures. Feedback matters. Community matters. Reputation matters. Responsibility to others matters. But the center of evaluation gradually shifts inward. The individual begins asking, does this align with my values? Does this feel coherent? Would this still matter without applause? Am I acting from reflection or from approval seeking? Is this genuinely meaningful to me? Am I becoming more conscious or merely more performative? Am I living from orientation or from comparison? These questions are difficult because they often expose hidden dependencies. Many people discover that large portions of their ambition, morality, identity, lifestyle, or worldview were organized more heavily around recognition than they previously realized. This realization can feel unsettling, but it also creates freedom, because once the individual becomes aware of how strongly external validation shapes behavior, they gain the possibility of gradually reclaiming authorship over attention, values, and direction. This does not happen all at once. The desire for approval rarely disappears completely. Human beings remain vulnerable to praise, rejection, comparison, and social signaling throughout life. The goal is not to eliminate these influences entirely. The goal is to prevent them from unconsciously governing the self. Over time, the person with a stronger inner scorecard becomes slightly less reactive to social turbulence. They no longer need every disagreement to feel existential. They become more capable of holding nuanced positions even when tribes demand conformity. They become less psychologically dependent upon appearing correct, admired, or morally pure at all times. This creates a quieter form of stability. Not arrogance, not isolation, not indifference, something closer to groundedness. The person still listens to others, still learns, still revises, still participates in community. But they are no longer entirely possessed by external evaluation. Reflection increasingly matters more than performance. Alignment matters more than applause. This shift also changes the emotional experience of success itself. Success organized around external scorekeeping often produces anxiety because there is always another comparison, another audience, another status hierarchy, another validation loop. Satisfaction remains unstable because the standards are socially moving targets. An inner scorecard changes the terrain. Meaning begins emerging more from coherence than comparison. The person gradually becomes more interested in living consciously, aligning action with values, participating honestly in relationships, cultivating awareness, and orienting toward what feels deeply true rather than merely socially rewarded. This orientation does not make life easier. In some ways, it can make life harder because external validation becomes less reliable as a compass. The individual must tolerate greater ambiguity and greater responsibility for their own choices. They can no longer outsource meaning entirely to tribe, status, or applause. But they also gain something precious: the possibility of becoming less psychologically dependent upon the crowd's constantly shifting judgment. And perhaps that is one of the clearest signs that self-possession is beginning to emerge. A person still belongs to the human world, but no longer needs the world to continuously tell them who they are.